about this. I've been interested in crypto mining for quite some time. And so when we were talking about kicking off the Enerex webinar series, this was an easy first topic for us. So thanks for filling out the poll. We're going to get started in the agenda for today. So just some housekeeping, making sure everybody can hear us, etc. Panelist intros, and we'll jump right into the topic. Joe, do you want to just bring us through housekeeping here?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for RSVPing and attending today's webinar. My name is Joseph Monroy, and I'm the marketing specialist here at Enerex. We really want you to engage in this webinar, so we enable the Q&A functionality where you can ask some questions, you can upvote other questions, comment on other questions, and just a reminder, this will be visible to all attendees, hosts, panelists, and attendees. So we want you also to chat with other hosts and panelists. These will only be visible to panelists, so if you want to shoot us some private questions, we can also answer them. You can also follow up with Enerex after the call with any other questions you might have. And if you need any support whatsoever, if you have any technical issues, you can't hear anything or can't see anything, go ahead and shoot me an email. My email will be right here, and I'll go ahead and drop it in the chat as well. Thanks so much, and enjoy today's webinar.
Fantastic. Joe, can't thank you enough for all your help and support on running these webinars. I know I couldn't do it without you, man, so really appreciate all the help with setting this up. I'm really excited to talk about the topic. So again, yeah, please engage with us as panelists. We will watch the Q&As and chats, and I will interlay them in. Special thanks goes out to TIPA. We were the TIPA affiliate back in 1920, still gunning for that award every single year. But really, really great relationship between Enerex and TIPA in terms of just supporting the retail energy industry. We will be in New York on April 7th. So just to plug that event for TIPA, we just had our Houston event last night. And for those joining us on the East Coast, we hope to see you in New York on April 7th. So why are you here today? Well, learning what the heck crypto mining is. As I see the poll here, I'm going to end it so everybody can see, from the, and then share results here. Everyone can see it's about 62% that are novice, 36% that are intermediate, and we got one expert out there. So the expert better chat us and tell us who he is, or she is for that matter. I would love to hear who that person is. That'd be fantastic. Anyway, but learning what the heck crypto mining is, learning about the structure of layered energy transactions. We've got some really great folks here that understand all of this and have helped build out facilities. And then really the effect it has on energy. You know, we've heard a lot of news articles that these are, not green, and it's going to be, such a detriment to society, crypto mining. And then you hear that, well, they have a lot of demand response capabilities and some really great things about them. We'll learn what the heck energy arbitrage is, because that's what crypto mining is told to be. And if you're a broker that has been approached by prospects about crypto mining and you want to talk to a few experts, that's really another piece of why we gathered these folks in the call today. There are a lot of brokers out there that do support this type of work. I'll introduce the panelists here, but again, you do have experts here, and I do hope you follow up with them after the call. That's definitely a big point of this webinar. This isn't a sales pitch for Enerex. It's just sharing with you why we do these webinars and why we bring people together in retail energy. It's part of our purpose statement, as you can see, connecting people. We really do appreciate all the attendance and the interest in these topics. We support the industry with a whole suite of solutions for both brokers and suppliers, and our real centralized focus is around commercial connectivity, trying to make retail energy transactions easier. We have agent portals, customer portals, commission statement generation tools for suppliers, again, the whole nine, and a lot of suite here to serve the industry. But with that, that's why we run the webinars, because we like to support the retail energy industry and make it a better place and share knowledge. And so I'd love to just introduce you real quick here. We'll start off with St. Clair. St. Clair with Live Energy CEO. St. Clair, so thanks so much for joining us today. I know you have a bunch of experience. How long have you been dealing in crypto mining for?
We started in 2013. I spoke at the first Bitcoin conference in San Jose and met some people, and that kind of started our path down the rabbit hole.
Very cool background, and excited to learn more about your knowledge here and everything you've accumulated over these past 9 years in such an emerging industry as well. I bet maybe some of the questions coming in is how much money did you invest and all that stuff, and we're not going to get into that today, man. We're talking about sharing knowledge. So Houston Abel with Abel Power Management, longtime stalwart in the retail energy industry, working for a broker before he went out on his own and running a really strong business in Abel Power Management. Houston, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I'll ask the same question. How long have you been dealing in crypto mining for?
We've been dealing in crypto for about a year.
So newcomer to the market, but have learned so much over a very rapid pace, fast-paced learning process because you've had clients that have brought you into that, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, so excited to learn about that too. Martin Smith here, by the way, thanks for texting us about being the expert. Greatly appreciated. Looking forward to your thoughts and opinions. But before we get to that, want to introduce Sean Andrews. Sean Andrews, EVP of Development for a solar development company, Cubix Energy, and has you want to talk about you want a spreadsheet and a data and analysis. Sean's my go-to guy. So for those who know me and my network, if he's my go-to guy for anything analytical, he should be your go-to guy too for anything analytical. Sean, thanks so much for joining us. What brought you into crypto and building up some knowledge in this space?
Thanks, Jason, and I appreciate that. I would mark myself as a novice, and I think even when I think about Excel, maybe novice to intermediate, but there's always more to learn. Really, it's just it's a big part of. I think that for our industry, we're like there's a big impact on what it has on the grid. And what's intrigued me a lot is, how it acts as a data center, but it also has some unique attributes that are a little bit more flexible than a traditional data center that doesn't have SLAs behind it and other things that different types of colos require from their users. So it's just a really interesting, I like all things tech related to energy. And so I just see this as a really interesting thing that's been developing over the years.
And this is such a hot topic, obviously, in our lives right now. And especially in terms of, a fluctuating market, which we'll learn a little bit more about today, that actually does have a lot of effect on whether to build or not to build a crypto mining facility. So let's start off with just generic. What the heck is crypto mining? I pulled this from Wiki, and that's what everybody should do when they're trying to understand this. But cryptocurrency mining is this competitive process that verifies and adds new transactions to the blockchain. Blockchain being a technology for transactions and a distributed ledger where multiple people are validating each individual transaction. And so this is for cryptocurrency. That's the proof of work method that I was just trying to describe. Pretty novice myself. And then the miner that wins the competition is rewarded with some amount of the currency and or transaction fees. And this is what crypto mining really is. It's building facilities with computers, for lack of a better, computer processors that are trying to win this competition. Now that is building computers in a facility is where this really intersects with energy. And so that's what we're going to focus on today, is the intersection of cryptocurrency mining in retail energy. So I'm going to kick it off with a question here. Why does crypto mining affect energy markets so greatly? And what is unique about their load and the way they operate? I'll start with St. Clair and work my way around the panelists for this one.
Well, the reason they affect energy markets so greatly is because they represent a potentially massive load, and they change the economics on the grid where they operate. So they impact the other participants in the market, and they have like for example, people have called Bitcoin miners the battery killers because they can operate as controllable load resource and often look like a battery on the grid. So as you see gigawatts of capacity potentially coming in, everybody should be thinking about, okay, if gigawatts of this load that looks like this comes in, what's that going to do to the economics in that particular part of the grid?
Absolutely. And you mentioned they kind of operate like batteries. What do you mean by that?
It's super flat load. So the idea for a miner is to operate 24/7, 365 with a very flat load. That's ideally they want to operate that way. So if you had a 100 megawatt site, they can also curtail like within seconds and drop that to almost zero. And if they had some backup, they could drop it to 0 in seconds. So it looks more like a battery than anything else, or like a spinning reserve. And so I've had discussions with people about what does that mean, and it could mean that they will provide services that were otherwise bid in by generators and things like that. So it just changed the economics of the system.
That's helpful. When you talk about this in terms of like Houston, add on to that a little bit of just why you think it, affects the market so greatly, and maybe even talk a little bit about this average load sizes. When you build a crypto mining facility, when I've talked to people, it always sounds like they buy a big facility, and so they do have to cool a decent amount of space. But really, the main power draw comes in when they're adding servers, right? Adding computer processors. That's where the main draw comes in. And so it sounds like a lot of these facilities start small and then become even more massive over time. So what's again, same question, but you can add on what St. Clair was saying and talk about like the average load sizes that you see as well in both peak and annual usage for these facilities.
Yeah, and so I would say to piggyback off what St. Clair has already shared, one of the biggest factors with crypto and what it's doing to the grid is they are paying for the improvement / growth of our infrastructure and grid, right? And so we are needing to add megawatts to meet these needs, which down the road is going to provide security for especially Texas for the continued economic growth. When you think of crypto deals, Jason, you nailed it on the head. If a customer comes to you and says, I want a 100 megawatt site, they can't just turn on 100 megawatts right away, right? They're going to prove out the model, put in their containers or their racks, and slowly increase the amounts, working hand in hand with a consultant or the utility direct to increase those megawatt hours over time. I would say from my experience, kind of the smaller deals would be your 30 megawatts and under. Your mid-sized deals would be, 30 up to 100, and then let's just call the 100 plus the large deals. And so, I've seen accounts as low as 2,000 kW up to 60,000 kW, a megawatt up to 500 megawatts. Got you.
And you're talking about, this is all in peak load. So when you multiply that by 8760, I mean, you're talking about, 20 million, 10 million, 20 million kilowatt hours a year, would you say, in annual kWh? What does that work out to?
For the big ones, it's hundreds of millions,
right?
500 to 800 million for a really large site. So it's massive. And then the unique piece that St. Clair touched on is similar to data centers. The load profile is literally
100%
like a full battery, right? And they are just ready to go. And in time of need, they can curtail at the snap of a finger with the technology that they have behind their site.
Two things I wanted to point out from what you just said to the audience is, you mentioned first off the size, right? Just the sheer size of volume of one of these facilities, because we talk about restaurants being 300,000 kWh. This is one facility that is that much usage. Those are powerhouses, right? We used to joke in the early days of energy. It's like we wanted the ice houses, right? We wanted the ice arenas because we knew that always had to be chilled and always had to be cooled, or a freezer, right? The freezer load. Well, now crypto mining is just that. It's 100% load. And so, you pointed out another thing was, this is actually paying for the grid enhancements. And what you mean by that, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, is that these crypto miners are coming in, they're paying their bills, they're adding more megawatt hours to the grid, which is going to then increase supply because generators are going to have to build more supply to keep up with the growing demand. And then on top of it, they're growing this demand to meet a load that can be curtailed and can be operated as demand response and improve the reliability of the grid in the long term, right? I just want to point that out. That was a really great point that you made, and excited, man. That was a really good point. So, did I phrase that back okay?
Yep.
Good, man. Sean,
they can help
add on to this, please.
Yeah, I actually really like what Abel said about paying for the improvement in infrastructure and growth of infrastructure, because as a renewable energy developer, some of the things we worry about and the grid worries about is intermittency of assets. Well, that intermittency and that sort of low capacity factor compared to a traditional generating plant requires load that can be easily shifted, so that you can manage frequency of the grid as units ramp up and down, and be able to react quickly to changes. And so I see it as a great add to the grid that you can to help facilitate the increase of the energy transition. So I know later we'll talk a little bit about the renewable aspect of it, but I was on the technical advisory committee for ERCOT back in 14-15, and a big topic at that time was resource adequacy. And, we talked about capacity markets, and we talked about all kinds of things. But what the concern on the, as you're moving forward is, how do you continue to grow in the renewable sector, and still be able to support base load? And so, the miners, just like any flat load, kind of helps kind of create that, but also, again, it reacts, right? It reacts to prices, it reacts to market conditions, which is what you really want in a true energy market.
We got a couple of absolutely great points, Sean. We got a couple questions coming in as well. I'll address one now, but I promise to address all these during the conversation. Have a couple of other questions coming up that'll address some of these. But one for this one is from Craig. While crypto mining facilities could curtail, would their potential lost revenue be worth it for them to do so? And what types of incentives are being considered to possibly take advantage of this curtailment? The last piece of that we'll answer in the demand response section. But I mean, would you say from what you're seeing, Sean, the curtailment is actually even more beneficial than some of the actual crypto mining that they do?
If it wasn't, they wouldn't curtail, right? I mean, it's about what the market triggers are doing for them, right? I mean, when prices are high, like they are right now, if anybody's looking at ERCOT's real-time market, it's because supply demand is tight. So it's that the way the market is set up is to drive behavior, and so if you're curtailing, it's because it's not economical. If it was economical, then you wouldn't curtail, you would continue to run, just like any asset. The thing is, this isn't a steel foundry where if you turn it off, you're not gonna be able to turn on for another day or something. So you have to think about not just that moment in time, but how long does it take me to ramp my operation back up, and how much am I gonna lose during that time? Well, crypto has a really quick calculation, like it's instantaneous, it's constantly going of, what is the ARB, which will, between, producing a coin or doing a transaction versus how much did it cost me for the energy.
Absolutely, man. Couldn't agree more. And we'll kind of get into that equation a little bit here more, and how crypto mining companies make money is a good question from Ira here as well, which we can answer here on this next question. So kind of learning about this a little bit more, we've heard the phrase that crypto mining is just energy arbitrage. There's some points coming in right now where it's like, hey, it's $3,000 a megawatt hour today because it's cold as heck in Texas. And we're talking about ERCOT, but obviously this is, based on each individual state, and we can talk about that later as well. But this energy arbitrage piece, and does the impact on the price of crypto have an effect on the viability of a mining farm? Meaning when Bitcoin prices were 60,000 versus where they're at now at 38, as of last night, I believe, maybe even less than that. Where is that price point? Where is that break even, if you will, in a market like ERCOT? Whoever wants to take this question can jump in.
I can take it. So the economics of every miner is going to be different, and it's going to be based on the actual hardware that they're running. And the key metric is like the hash rate. What's the hash rate of the hardware that you're operating? And so there's older generation machines that, because mining's become so profitable, are still running, that were produced 4 or 5 years ago, while the newest machines are going to be generate the best performance. But if you're so one of the key things I think that is important is to understand like how to look at deals and figure out if they're going to actually be profitable. And you have to get down to the hardware, to the chip level, and understand like how to measure that. And it's measured in hash rate. So performance is measured in terahash per second. That's how many hashes the chips can perform in a second. And then you look at the performance of the hash rate in terms of the efficiency of the chips, measured in joules per terahash or watts per terahash. So for every terahash, how many watts of energy is it using? And then you look back at, what was my cost to acquire the hardware? So what was my dollar per terahash? And then at the end of the day, once you're up and running, it's pretty easy to figure out, okay, I'm able to, buy power at 5 cents, and I'm, making 40 cents in profit. And that's where back to the previous question, there's often a a strike price where they just know that if the market trades above X, then we're going to sell back to the grid. So when the arbitrage works, in the energy market, they shift over and they can sell back into the grid and make more money there mining. But the interesting thing on the hardware is we've gone from CPUs to GPUs to FPGAs to ASICs, and now ASICs, which are application specific integrated circuits, are what are running in all the Bitcoin mining farms. For Ethereum, it would still be graphics cards, but for Bitcoin, it's ASICs. And back in 2013, just a little bit of point of reference. Back then there was one ASIC that came out, and it was 110 nanometer, and so that blew all the FPGAs out of the water. And then came a 65 nanometer chip, which is the first thing we did. Was we bought some 65 nanometer chips and we built boards. And the interesting thing at that time was we knew there was only a single producer of that chip on the planet. So it was much easier to establish, okay, what's the hash rate going to look like? Well, we know there's one company producing one chip, and that's going to blow everything else out of the water. And you could literally watch the network grow, and you could tell, oh, Butterfly Labs must have just released a batch of hardware, because the hash rate would pop up. And now here we are, almost 10 years later, and we have over a half dozen major suppliers and Intel getting in. So the ability to do an accurate pro forma has gotten way harder, because you don't know what hardware is going to come on. Now we're down to 7 nanometer chips, like a Bitmain S19 is a 7 nanometer chip, very efficient, and Intel's entering the market. So it's getting a lot more difficult, but if you're going to successfully execute the arbitrage, you have to understand down to the chip level and the mechanical performance of the infrastructure, and a lot of other variables. But that's kind of the gist of it.
That's really helpful. And so you talk about hash rate, and that's like the computer solving this equation, back to that generic example that I gave of what crypto mining is, right?
Yeah, and so every time a miner solves a block, they take all the transactions and they validate the transactions within the block, and then they create a hash of the entire block of information. They use a formula that then multiplies that times a certain, or they take into consideration another variable where they're trying to create a hash of that information that meets the difficulty required to successfully mine a block. And the difficulty is what allows the network to monitor the rate of issuance of the Bitcoin. So as more hash rate comes online, it may speed up the block time. So blocks may start clearing faster than 10 minutes. And so the difficulty adjustment is designed to evaluate the rate that blocks are being mined, and either adjust the difficulty up and make it harder for miners to solve blocks, or adjust it down. And it's always trying to bring it back. Every 2 weeks or so, the algorithm basically self-heals and retargets 10-minute blocks. So the goal is to always have 10-minute blocks, and it's pretty amazing. That's one of the really novel things about blockchain and Bitcoin, is that it does this all by itself. Like if you're running the software, and everybody has to be in consensus running the same software and agreeing on everything that's going on. But yeah, that's kind of how I look at it.
Got it, interesting, and love, Sean, go ahead and add on to that. So when we talk about what are the different variables that a crypto miner takes into consideration. So far that I've heard, right, it is the computer processing stacks, right, that you're using. And what would you say, St. Clair, just real quick for the audience, what over the last 10 years, how in a percentage, how much more efficient have these machines got? Is it 10x of what they were, in 2013? Is it 100x in terms of the efficiency?
Definitely. So the first chips we bought were, gigahash chips. Now we're at terahash.
It's 1,000x, right?
Yeah. So I mean, and initially when we went from 110 nanometer chip to 65, that was like an exponential improvement on the previous generation. Now but the improvements as you go from if you go from a 28 to 16 to 7, now they're not making as much of an incremental jump, and they're not getting as much improvement in the efficiency in the newer chips. So back, in 2013, when a new chip would come out, it would literally make everything else, pretty much worthless. because there was such big jumps going from 110 to 65 nanometer to 28 nanometers to 16, and now we're down around 7. So the improvements generation to generation aren't as significant, but from 2013 to today, yeah, it's massive.
There is a question here, Sean, add on to this whole point of what other thing that's interesting on the efficiency side. What are some of the other pieces that you feel like are taken into this equation? And start talking about like energy prices and demand response and those type of things that would go into a consideration. While you do this, there's also a question. Thanks so much for bringing these in, Chris. Looking for a little bit of answer in terms of the internet speeds, and does that matter, right? Does that matter to the equation if you're using gig speeds or half gig speeds in terms of internet connectivity? Does that matter at all? Sean, you want to add on to that with the variables, and if you know
sure.
anything about the internet side?
Sure. So I think about my high school chemistry class, and if anybody remembers the term stoichiometry, and basically just going from variable to variable. So St. Clair was talking about terahash per second, watts per terahash. How many terawatt hashes does it take to solve a block? All that is you're taking units and you're converting them, and so you can get to a dollars to produce a coin, and then how much do you get on the other side? I mean, it's that it all boils down to that, right? Like, so the cost of energy obviously is the main input being the largest variable cost, and the majority variable cost of producing something. If you go back further up the chain, and look at the investment requirements for something like this, you might consider, what kind of return do I need to make, by investing, however many tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars that I put into this, and how long is it going to take for me to get that back? And the miners only, from my understanding, only last, let's say 5 years or something, and can you get more use out of them and that sort of thing. So I think about some of the value that you thinking about the processing speed and going 1000x. I mean, necessity being the mother of innovation, right? And the driver of that. And in this case, the system, through the blockchain commands things to be quicker, and it does that by saying, here's the value you're going to get for increasing this. So imagine what that increased processing because of the drivers that are happening here with Bitcoin is doing to the rest of the world, and AI and machine learning and just any other tech that you can think of that we're going to be leveraging here based on the innovations that are being created here specifically for Bitcoin, but that will apply to everything else in the world. It's really
good macro level thought to be continuing to think about. Absolutely.
Someone mentioned something that is important too in the whole arbitrage thing, and like the economics is whether the facility is offloading the Bitcoin rewards. So as they're mining, like I'd say definitely in the early days, a lot of miners would sell Bitcoin to cover their OpEx as they're going. So if they mine 10 Bitcoin, they may sell half the Bitcoin to cover their cost. Now we have public miners that have access to public markets, and so there's less pressure on miners, and there's less pressure right now for them to sell because they're making because the margins. But that is something that's kind of new, where we've got a lot of players that now have access to capital markets, and so they don't have the pressure to sell Bitcoin. And so that puts less downward pressure on the market because there's not as much that's being mined and immediately sold.
Interesting. So you're saying people are holding off on selling them more now than they used to?
Yeah, I think if you ask any miner, do you like having to sell Bitcoin? And they'll say no. But they were doing it out of necessity because they didn't have access to funding, and so in order to fund their expansion, they would fund it in Bitcoin. I mean, I've literally bought. So I went back and looked at some hardware we bought where, I paid 25 Bitcoin for a piece of hardware that was like $5,000 or something. It was a really dumb thing, but we did it because we're like, well, we got this Bitcoin. Let's reinvest.
That was what it was valued at, right? It looks like hindsight.
Yeah, but so everyone who's done that knows, like, okay, I'd rather not sell ever if I don't have to, and so with access to public markets, that's an option, that's viable for more operators.
Makes a lot of sense. Here, a couple questions coming in too around, just not understanding how they make money and things like that. There is a finite amount of coins to mine. I'd say that, the Bitcoin video is something I watched in preparation for this, and it helped me understand exactly how a crypto miner makes money. But again, they're solving an equation with a computer program, and then they get a transaction fee, right? And which comes in the form of Bitcoin. And so now you own a Bitcoin, and then yes, there is a finite amount of coins to mine, which is what drives up the price. And there's a halving formula. And again, panelists of experts, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a halving formula that every 4 years in Bitcoin specifically, it then halves the value of what a Bitcoin miner gets. So let's say if they were getting 1 Bitcoin, 4 years later, they're only getting a half Bitcoin for solving that equation. Then it's 25 cents of 0.25 of a Bitcoin, et cetera, as the hash.
It started at 50, then went to 25, then 12 and a half, then 6.25. And that's the block reward. So every time a miner solves a block, they include all the transactions for that time period. And then they include what's called a Coinbase transaction, which is a new, where it mints new Bitcoin. It says, okay, so I validated all these transactions. Now, in addition, since I solved the block, send 50 Bitcoin to my address. And so that's how the transaction happens.
Yep. And Josh, really appreciate that comment here. I'll call it out here as he was just saying to the other folks, is that the year 2140 is when the last Bitcoin would be mined based on the current progress in Bitcoin. But there will also be other coins out there, as we know, and other ways to mine them. So just kind of bringing the conversation a little bit more back to the mining and how it's with energy. Houston, if you can talk about this a little bit, you've built up a lot of knowledge over the last year in these facilities that you're working with. What are some of the other variables, like size of space? Is that really a high driver? Like, what are the top 3 costs of a Bitcoin mining facility?
I mean, outside of infrastructure, the price of power, the real big hurdle for the energy arbitrage piece is a lot of the large miners that are foreign coming into the US. It is very difficult for them to get credit to perform large block purchases. And so there's a ton of collateral that's required. And so for the most part, they're going to ramp up over time on real time. And that's how demand response has become such a huge piece of what they do and understand. They are very good at that piece, understanding the real-time data and reacting to it. For the energy arbitrage piece, once they get established and they're able to go out and buy a 25, 50, 100 megawatt block, now what they're doing is kind of transformed into the home run is not finding Bitcoin anymore. It's reacting to a pricing event where they can monetize the block. I mean, I've heard examples of groups over, let's say the winter storm that made $20, $30 million over that week unloading a position. And so that's where the real money is once they get fully integrated in the US and have credit facilities to go out and purchase what they need to purchase when the market's right.
Right. And that's a great comment, is that, there was a couple questions around that of like what type of products that they go with. And so Index in the beginning, as they understand and establish kind of what their mining equation is and how many Bitcoin they're getting for what energy. And then they're looking at that and saying, okay, well, then if I can buy a $70 a megawatt block, or in Texas, probably in the 50s for energy, then I am now going to sell back some of that position when it's $3,000 a megawatt hour and I'm long. I bought it at 70. Now I'm cashing in, just like I'm cashing in on Bitcoin. I'm cashing in on the energy long position that I have because I can use it, right? If not, and I'm not going to be in a position where I'm not using the power and having to sell it back into the grid at less than what I bought it for. Am I restating that okay?
Yeah. I mean, I would say you think of block prices in Texas in the 3-cent range.
It's in the 3-cent range. Okay.
That's where opportunity gets attractive for them, and it really needs to be more towards the bottom of that.
Awesome. Sorry, I was just reading a question. Cool. This is really good. We're going to start kind of talking about, what are these, going more into this demand response piece and anything that you feel like benefits that crypto miners give to the grid. So I think we've talked about this a little bit. I'll skip it over quickly, but Houston, talking about, we've talked about reliability, new generation. Anything to add there to this question?
Yeah, new generation infrastructure upgrades that at the end of the day are improving the systems.
Absolutely. Anything to add on this question? I think we've done a pretty good job covering some of these things in our early questions.
I think
Every
go ahead.
megawatt sold is one of the things people always say. Like, ideally every megawatt sold, how much would it improve if every megawatt sold? So, guys like Sean can have projects that are, producing some cash faster than, they otherwise would. So.
Yeah, I think, and that's a good point, Sinclair. And one more thing that, you have demand response, but you also have frequency response, right? And we talked a little bit about it before, but, the ancillary service aspect of it, and being able to bid as a load response into the grid. And, one of the things that we have learned over the years is the value of load versus generation. And the value of load actually in response to economic situations on the grid being higher than the value of gen. And so just give you like a simple example of that. If you have 50,000 megawatts of load and you drop by 1,000, you have an excess of 1 over 49, 1,000 over 49. If you increase gen by 1,000, it's 1 over 50. And so just that percentage of capacity available by reducing load versus increasing generation has a slightly higher value to it.
Interesting. And that's talking about line losses there?
I'm just talking about, the capacity and available capacity on the grid, which drives our prices, right? Supply demand. Dropping 1,000 megawatts of load is more valuable than increasing 1,000 megawatts of gen. Yeah,
because it lowers the denominator. So
yeah, right.
Mathematically,
absolutely.
It's sound.
No, this is great. And so, another question around demand response offerings, because we're talking about that a little bit right now that came in, is it a good idea for the site to shut down in peak time when PLCs are set? And are you guys doing that with any of the mining facilities that you've been a part of?
Yes, that's an important part of it. Of course it's getting more challenging, so you have to account for more hours to try and hit all the peaks, but it's definitely, people want that as part of the strategy.
Absolutely. Anything to add to that, Houston?
No, I think that pretty much covers it.
Really good help there. And when we're looking at, these different type of demand response, programs like Sean was saying, I think another question that commonly comes up, you talked about them being like batteries, but as batteries become more of a piece, do you see these crypto mining facilities using battery and behind the meter solar, Sean, with what you're doing? Is there any additional efficiencies for a mining facility that has that type of infrastructure?
I think, for batteries, I think just from the perspective of cleaning the power, I mean, just like any data center, when it comes in, battery, everything will have its own economics. The battery is going to have its own economics. The solar is going to have its own economics. And it's all going to be integrated with, you've got load. If you have generation behind it, what does that look like? How does it change the load shape? By changing the load shape, how does it change my cost to serve or my cost of energy on average, right? And so that's the equation we're constantly working with as a solar company with behind the meter assets is, what is our avoided cost that we're essentially offsetting by adding solar? So if I'm selling a PPA for 5 cents and their rate is 8 cents and for that same power, then you're in the money, right? Like you're making money by having solar behind the meter. So a lot of factors. I think, what's interesting is, with, again, just generically with data centers, I mean, a lot of times we're in heavy load pockets with Bitcoin mining or crypto mining in general, I should say. Bitcoin just seems to be it's kind of the bigger one, but, you have a little bit more flexibility of location. And so really you're just looking for the cheapest and most reliable energy. It's not necessarily like a data center needing to be near where people are using the internet and where people are downloading data so that you can be quicker, right?
Makes sense.
And so that being said, there's a data center, if I'm looking at behind the meter solar, because the energy is so dense, the rooftop is going to offset less than 1% of their energy usage, which is really kind of pointless.
Yeah, because there's such high demand within the facility.
Yeah, in a small space, right? You don't have a lot of space. Whereas a data center out in the middle of nowhere, you could put it out on a wind farm when wind is pushing out and getting negative pricing, instead of curtailing, like St. Clair said, all megawatts hours being used. You can run your facility.
A lot of great sense there. We have a question coming up in terms of talking about the facility selection process, as well as like what it takes to build a mining facility. And I know there's some really great questions that have come in around that. So last question here though is any type of control systems or things that you guys, other companies, third-party companies that you guys want to work with might be a plug, today for people that you work with in terms of control systems, right? There has to be some type of dashboard where these people are watching their energy monitoring, and right, it's well over what we do as a broker and supplier industry. There has to be other, control programs. Anything to answer that question from Claire about what kind of control systems are commonly used by crypto facilities? And thanks, Martin. Hive OS is something that somebody had.
Yeah, there's a lot of different pieces of software that people use for mining, where you can manage all the rigs and have price signals that help you curtail. So, it's not that complicated, really. I mean, you're sending a command to basically stop the hashing when you curtail. You're not, it's not like you're pulling the plug out of the wall. You don't want everything to just get turned off immediately. But you've got a cooling factor in there. So that's one reason why you can't instantaneously drop the load. You've got to maintain some base load to keep, so even if you stop a computer from hashing, then the chips are still going to be hot. So you're going to want the fans on the units to run, and you're going to want the fans on your facility to run, or the liquid to keep flowing if it's an immersion cooled system. And so there's software that can handle all those commands pretty easily, and have APIs where you can connect in and operate based on certain parameters that you set, or certain data feeds that they're attached to.
Absolutely.
And a lot of people do it themselves. I mean, because it's not that complex. If you've got 1,000 rigs, you're probably going to use either a open source or a paid version of some software that allows you to, manage pools and manage the settings of all the miners that you're running. But people have a lot of homegrown software too that have developed from the open source software that we had in 2013.
Houston, anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, to piggyback off that, I would say more times than not, they're going to use their internal method / technology tool. And then the piggyback off that, whoever they align themselves with on the QSE side is obviously going to provide them the same support as kind of a backup to what they're doing on their own to make sure all bases are covered in regards to curtailment events.
One thing that's going to be interesting is, to see how well people can react, because most miners, like particularly in the earlier days, when you got everything up and running, it was like, don't touch it, nobody touch it, don't turn it off, don't stop it. And so
getting so much Bitcoin,
like
right?
it's like a bunch of spinning plates. So if you had like 200 machines and you turn them all off, when you turn them back on, you may only have 190. Then you got to go figure out why 10 of them didn't turn on. And so it'll be interesting to see, and that's certainly one of the things that the hardware manufacturers are trying to develop, is more resilient systems that can be responsive. But it'll be interesting to see, because I've seen, contracts that require a ton of curtailment, and it makes me a little bit nervous. Like, man, that's a lot of off and on and stopping and starting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that starting and stopping is interesting, because it's all this is all about this equation, right? And why you should consult experts like these panelists if you have customers here. But, a question just came in around, it doesn't sound like, solar and wind, like Sean said, it's only 1% of their total usage that you could actually even put solar panels on the roof. And most of these facilities are going to be warehouses, right? And in the middle of where, right? Like, is it in the middle of nowhere, or is it better if it's like within a city, right? That's a question that I have for you guys, but play off of that, Sean, if you can. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are from solar wind.
In terms of the rooftop, that's what I was referring to, being there's just not enough space, right? But if you're in a remote territory where you can do a ground mount right next to, think about utility scale solar, but putting it behind the meter, or very large. So I think that there's value in that. I mean, it all boils down to, what is your, there's a couple of things too, that'll come into play there. We talked about credit earlier. We're talking long-term offtake arrangements require credit, so you have to get around that hurdle. But assuming you do, one of the things that solar provides is some stability in the price, because you're able to execute on a long-term at a certain rate. So where you're dealing with the market, generally speaking, and managing, their retail contracts and dealing with block hedges and whatnot, and all the adders associated as well. Behind the meter can add some stability in pricing long term.
So talk about that a little bit more, and maybe Houston and St. Clair. I know it's got a lot of experience, but Houston with the more recent experience, kind of in line with moving on to some of our other questions. But before we get to this one, Dan Sullivan asked a great question about presenting, you presented an opportunity for a crypto miner. And then are these folks that are getting long-term PPAs, like is the utility, we talked about generation, Houston, and it needs more generation as more of these facilities come online, and a lot of them are coming to Texas. What are these facilities doing to procure load? Are they going through a traditional REP, the suppliers that we work with as brokers, or do they actually have to sign some agreement with the utility that they're going to be on and producing for a longer period of time?
That pretty much depends on where in the country you're setting up your facility. For the most part in Texas, you'll be operating as, on paper as a CNI customer. And so that the hurdles there at that point are just pretty much credit on what you're going to be able to get set up in regards to optionality at the site. But beyond that, business as usual. Once you get up into the 400 or 500 megawatt deals, there is some utility interface that has to happen, just due to the sheer size of the deal. But your 30 megawatts and under, just rule of thumb, consider that a normal CNI transaction.
Very helpful. Appreciate that. And thanks for a lot of people jumped on the call today that, are also seeming to be, a lot more expert than I am. I'm still a novice in this. And so appreciate everybody jumping in and just sharing best practices. This is what we create as a forum for this. We are going to go through the last question here, and I will save time for it, which is about the standing up a crypto mining facility, which is somewhere where these questions. But real quickly, if I could, Houston, St. Clair, Sean, go around, what states within the USA are gaining crypto miners and why? We know that. And maybe not even just in the USA, Houston, maybe kick this off and talk about, some experience you've had in Canada as well.
Yeah. And so, early on when kind of the China, Kazakhstan exodus happened, a lot of those miners looked at North America, and the first logical place for them was Canada. The weather, for what that does for, machines, was ideal. And then in theory, the access to an abundant amount of natural gas was the second piece. And so what they found out going over there's a ton of red tape, very difficult to get set up and operating there. And so next step, let's look south into United States, and, it's spread out the Northeast, let's say Pennsylvania. I've heard Ohio, I've heard some gas play only states, Oklahoma. And then right now, there's a huge rush to Texas because miners want to be in a red state. They want to be in a state that's going to embrace them for the economic benefits, especially given, the news wasn't directly in New York geared towards actual mining, but there are a few groups that got slapped on the wrist that are going to go through some investigation right now. And so that's happening. And so in the mining community, that has raised some red flags about setting up shop in blue states.
Yeah, that's really important too, and why we see such a rush into Texas. Sean, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, so what you're talking about there is regulatory risk, right? Like, which is something that we deal with in a lot of different areas of the business, and clearly impacts miners. And it's not just regulation on energy, but it's all different kinds of regulation, whether ancillary or direct. You got to think about the banks and their lobbying power and what crypto mining has done to their business, and what they push for, and so there's all different kinds of motives out there of why someone from a regulatory perspective might push for or push against what we're doing. But I mean, I think you named the states, mainly it's wherever you're going to find low cost of energy. So New York and Texas. Texas, I think, lower cost of energy, but also the transparency in the market, and the ability and the trust that the regulatory environment is built on economics to some extent for energy. Of course, you got to protect the consumers and protect the grid. I think reliability is a number one priority in Texas in general. But everything else is let's bring in whatever innovation is going to solve any issues that we're having on the grid. And so these different facilities are going to go where they can participate, or where there's cheap energy. So like Nebraska, Kentucky are two other places, but those are heavy coal states, and maybe when you think about just because they have cheap energy because of that, but it's really going to be driven by the transparency, the regulatory environment, and the trust in the state's ability to manage that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so, you think about it, we've talked about this in terms of, you just talked about, right, a negawatt, meaning somebody who's reducing load is actually more beneficial to the grid than somebody who's generating. So do you think if states wanted to attract a lot of new e-commerce and transactions with crypto mining, let's say a state like, Nevada or New York, or Wyoming, a place where there's a lot of land, could they do a lot of incentives on demand response specifically to build the facilities there and then be able to control the load that would attract more general? Like, could you see a state taking this on and just wanting to be the crypto mining capital of the US? And anyone can answer that.
There is mining in Wyoming, and there's mining in a lot of places that you wouldn't think of. I mean, I'm looking at a list, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Florida, Tennessee, Indiana, Iowa, Maine.
Houston, you just listed all red states to your comment.
Yeah.
Except Maine. Maine, I don't know. I think Maine goes back and forth, but everything else.
Kazakhstan, Iceland, Canada. Canada's, got more red tape, so people aren't as excited about going there. But there's also, where there's energy plays where they can utilize stranded gas. That's a natural fit as well. So you get markets that may not have competitive electricity, but they've got stranded gas that can be monetized and turned into electricity and used.
Right.
Yeah, and that actually goes a little bit outside of what we're talking about, because it doesn't necessarily impact retail markets, other than the fact that they put their asset there instead of on the grid, where you can go straight to areas that are flaring, drop a 1-2 megawatt lease a generator, and just be islanded, right? You're not connected to the grid at all, and you have relatively free fuel source, natural gas, and therefore extremely low cost energy, and all you're paying for is the lease on your generator.
That's incredibly helpful, guys. I really appreciate it. I want to camp out on this last. We did have a last question about the green and touching on that. I don't know if we're going to have time for that today, but I think a lot of folks are interested in this. So I'm going to kind of guide this question, and I do hope everyone jumps in as they see fit. But so the first question here is starting off with standing up a crypto mining facility. First off, are these sites typically served at the transmission level? James Risk had asked a question here. So is that typically they're higher load level customers, and so they're speak to that, transmission level customers?
The biggest projects will come in where there's capacity and transmission, and build private substations and transform the power and avoid some of the transmission and distribution costs associated with taking it distribution level. So anything like 100 megawatts, probably going to have their own substation and all the cost that goes with that.
That's helpful. Anybody else want to comment on that? So it sounds like smaller facilities can probably get under the hurdle risks of what we're about to talk about. With like some of these larger facilities, you're going to go through a lot of more red tape with the utility interconnections, et cetera. Can somebody do a smaller mining facility and not have to,
Yeah, I mean, you can.
Customer?
The lowest hanging fruit would be, a site that's already got, a couple of megawatts at distribution level. Go in there and you can get up and running today. Whereas if you're building a private substation, hell, that may take you 18 months. So it's interesting. There's like lots of little pockets that used to exist. I'd say that, the market's pretty well picked over. So, people have been picking off all those little opportunities for the past year. And so there's, a lot less opportunity that is existing. And so we're having to shift to projects that require significant upgrades, whether that's, getting primary power or taking it transmission and doing your own private substation. So
quite interesting. I think
that's
John?
one of the factors you have to think about, right, Jason? If it's going to take you 12 to 18 months to get something up and running, where's the price? You have to really be comfortable with where you think the price of crypto is going to be at that time. And, did you already order your miners? Are there's fluctuation, supply demand factors that are hitting every aspect of the value chain.
Quite interesting. There is a question here about, sorry, actually, I don't understand that one. So let's talk about standing up one of these facilities and what you actually go through. And let's talk about more of a larger facility. You said sites were a little bit picked over. Chris is an expert. He's saying he's got a couple sites, and I'm sure there are still some out there, but let's say somebody approaches, me, and I'm not a broker. So I come to Houston or St. Clair and I say, hey, I got this opportunity. This guy's talking about, he's got, $10 million to spend and ready to become a crypto miner, right? What would you take through as the logistics of standing up a facility?
First, I'd point him to the line and say, get in line. And then I'd say, do you have a site? And then when he says no, I say, okay, other line. And then, so there's more capital and people chasing the opportunity than there is sites and rack space right now. So it's kind of like the arms race was, to get your hands on chips, in early years. Now the arms race is to get capacity in rack space. So, the first thing is finding a site, which, a lot of people that reach out to us, they don't have a site. And so that is a whole process in and of itself to identify, because Encore or AEP, they're not going to give you a list of substations and tell you where the power is. You've got to figure that all out you're on your own and do every bit of due diligence to verify that the capacity's there. And then from there you get into what once you know what's there and what's available, then you look into what kind of infrastructure makes sense, whether it's going to be like a modular solution or a fixed structure. And then, from there you get down into the hardware and your buying strategy on the hardware so that you can try and have everything kind of converge on the day that you go live. So there's a lot of different steps, a bunch of steps in the process of standing up a facility, but generally it starts with the site. And I don't want to talk, the whole time. I mean, others can jump in here, but I'll just say this. It's a real bitch right now to do the research. And so the people that we generally want to work with have a site. We have some sites that we've worked to develop, but that's the hardest thing to find right now, is actually viable sites, and then deals where we can really nail down the economics and the timelines to make something look attractive.
Absolutely.
I would put a number at that on St. Clair's 2 lines, right? And the amount of people coming into the front line where they've got a site identified and now they just need you to confirm details for them. That's maybe 5% of the market from what I'm seeing. The other 95% come to you and I want a turnkey solution. I want you to find me a place for my mining site and I want it right now. And so there's going to be a reckoning in the crypto world where these guys are going to switch their focus from hitting us on 4 cents, get me there now, to a land grab, right? To capture potential future megawatt hours. And that's, at some point, the shift isn't there yet. It's still very picky and particular towards us. That's going to change at some point, I think, this year, where it's going to become a land grab and everyone's going to get comfortable with the notion of, we can't deploy our machines today. There's a process we have to go through. And to get through that process and build out the necessary infrastructure is 12 to 18 months. And that it is what it is.
I think that's really important to know. There's this entire process, and it's a lot of education. It sounds like, when somebody that doesn't have the knowledge of actually standing up a facility comes and says, well, I got money, let's just stand up. I got a site, I got 10 acres, in La La Land, right, in Texas. And there's a lot of that, by the way. As you drive from city to city, it's pretty awesome to see how much land we do have here in the great state of Texas. But, it's just, that's not feasible, right? That's not going to be near a substation, and it's going to be harder to get power to those rural facilities and things like that. And so, sure, it is a lot of education on these type of things. There is a good question here. It's like, what part of the process do you start running into credit risk, right? Is that after you've found a site, and, after, like, when do you start getting into credit risk, and what makes a crypto developer owner a good credit risk? Great question, Rich Rathbon, if you're still on. Thank you.
I'll take that one. I think, simply put, if it's an American-based organization, it's going to be much easier to review and understand their credit. If they're a foreign entity, it's going to be very difficult. I mean, there's just no way around that. It is what it is at this point. And so it's a matter of understanding you're going to have to establish that credit over time and be comfortable with the risk associated with not having a credit facility available to you.
Would you say that these are businesses that are typically startup businesses, or are they established businesses that are entering crypto, like, an Aon, and says, I want to build a facility, right, an insurance company or something like that, and they obviously have the credit in the balance sheet, and those are the ones that are standing up? Or is it just individual investors that are starting up a new LLC and building a facility?
I think it's just when suppliers hear the word crypto, their eyes open up, and they're going to take a look at every single detail on whatever you provide them for credit purposes, making it much more difficult to just push the deal through.
Absolutely. You think that, are the suppliers doing more short-term deals with these folks because of that credit risk, and then reestablishing it after 6 months? Or are they going, in ERCOT, I've heard deals go as long as 10 years. Obviously, you're not doing 10 years unless you have really great credit, but
yeah, I'd say very, very few. I'd say more deals is getting suppliers comfortable with at least providing, 6 months or a year of block purchase
with reliable payment. And if they're that far, then they'll reestablish and maybe do a longer term block after that. Great information there. Really,
there's KYC and AML and all that are a huge part of it too. Figuring out who the hell's involved. And then even if you have a big balance sheet, that doesn't mean that you can actually develop a site that makes any money. So, like, even if you have all the money in the world, you've still got to pick the right infrastructure and put it in the right place, secure the right hardware at the right dollar per terahash, get the right performance. So it's pretty tricky. I've had conversations with retailers that wanted to understand that we're struggling with the credit support component, and they were like, hey, how do we even figure this out? And so I've had conversations where I've helped them understand, like, okay, if it were me, I would go down to these questions at this level of granularity. And, if the easiest thing to do is to assess the credit risk on someone who has a site that's got capacity today, they have all their hardware on the ground, and they're saying, we want to start right now, because you can create a pro forma that's, relatively accurate based on the current hash rate, network hash rate growth.
Versus where, if they're not starting up for 18 months, the variability and the variables that you're considering in this question, you don't even know what they're going to be. You don't know what the price of the Bitcoin is going to be. You don't know if they're going to be financially viable that far out.
Yeah. So then you take a site where they say, we've got a site, but there's nothing on it yet. So now you have all this execution risk. Can they even get the transformers? Can they get the site built in the time that they said? Can they get it connected? And if they don't, how fucked are they if they bought all this hardware and now the hardware can't go online?
Right.
So there's like these parallel paths that have to all converge on them going live, and make sure that their hardware purchases and their infrastructure choices, and the data, service, and everything comes together so that when it's time to go live, they've made good decisions, and they're economically viable.
Really helpful, St. Clair. Hey guys, I'm gonna, typical Jason Beck fashion, always running overtime, and these topics are so great. Great questions from our folks. I'm gonna end with a question to Sean here. I'm not gonna be able to really go into this in detail, but Sean, there was a question that was asked here about, do you think that there will be federal or state regulations that will require these facilities to procure 100% renewable energy? Since you're in the renewable energy space, do you feel like certain states like New York and again, these are the blue states, but they might come out and say that you have to greenify your usage?
Yeah, I'm a firm believer in free markets, so I hope not.
Yeah.
I don't think that the regulation should be at the level of a type of customer. I mean, because otherwise, what other types of customers do you want to be 100% renewable? Now, if you want to create state regulations around 100% renewable, you can create those, and those incentives and the costs associated with that will drive the economics of whether crypto miners will be in your state or not.
Exactly.
And so I like to see it kind of more coming from that angle. In terms of them being environmentally unfriendly, I mean, they're just load, just like anything else pulling power off the grid. You could call every restaurant you eat at, that doesn't have 100% renewable contract,
Right.
I mean, so, my food was not produced by renewable energy, so I'm not
Yep.
eating there, right? Like,
Yep.
to what level do you want to take this? Like I said earlier, I think, the energy transition and what's required to create this, to add more renewables to the grid requires load that can be reactive.
Yes.
And every new retail energy provider touts all the different products that they offer for load response. I can control your thermostat, I can control your electric water heater. Let's electrify everything so that it can be controlled and managed. And there's a value associated with that, right? Like comfort versus value. Are you going to pay me $5 a year to control my thermostat and I'm going to sweat in the summer? That's not enough for me. Is it $100? Is it $200? I mean, all of that is driven by the economics in the program, and people are willing to compromise, based on certain
Incentives.
for some incentives, right? So,
Right.
And I think that's the case with crypto miners and everything else that we do in our lives.
It's such a, obviously we know that it's huge load, and that's why it's getting the bad press that it does, because it's such a big draw. But if thought about correctly, and this is, I think, what I'm trying to share for our folks, that participants that are still on from our panelists today, it is 100% a controllable load and should be viewed as a positive to the grid versus a negative. And in 2040, when Bitcoin is done mining, there will be other coins to mine and to continue to make money off of, in my humble opinion, with everything that is going on. If you're not on Coinbase and seeing all the new coins pop up, you should be. There's a lot of.
Well, and let's go, if there isn't, what happens then? You take all that load off the grid, and all of a sudden you have this infrastructure that was built, and everybody's benefiting from that.
The environmental thing is, in my opinion, just a bullshit issue. It's not, I mean, Bitcoin mining already is one of the greenest industries on the planet, because they have flocked to hydro and they've flocked to cheap stranded capacity. So it's just dishonest to try and say, oh, well, that industry, that use of energy is not worthy. I mean, I don't think that anybody is in a position to say that. And if you understand, philosophically what Bitcoin means in terms of economic access, and, it's freedom money, of course, I'd say that it's a noble use of energy, even if it used coal. To me, we should be able to use energy for any purpose that we want. If we want to start debating what is a good use of energy, we could look at how much energy is used to watch Netflix or play video games or do all kinds of other stupid things that don't advance humanity. And I think that it's just FUD, and I think it's people that are anti-crypto not because they're being honest about things, but because they don't understand it or just trying to play on fears that are unfounded.
Really good point to close this out, St. Clair. I think a lot of folks, we all believe in free markets. That's why we're here in retail energy and talking about these things. So I think this is really good points. And I just wanted to thank, this is by far the most amount of chat conversations. So Brendan, Chris, Martin, if I'm leaving anybody out here, Josh, really good comments and questions throughout this conversation, and we really appreciate your participation. Might even have a follow-up webinar with additional experts. I really do hope everybody on the call, if you have any real questions or opportunities, go talk to our panelists today. Houston, Sean, St. Clair will all help you out. If you need anything from us, obviously you can always reach out to me and I will help you go ahead and get connected with these folks. As I close out this webinar here, we will be at EMC coming up here. If you're not aware of what Energy Marketing Conference is and you're in the residential and small commercial and mass market space, definitely a conference you should be looking at. And then we are going to, it says insert next webinar name here, but guess what? We actually have it. Our next webinar is going to be on natural gas and the intersection of natural gas and electricity. So many folks within our industry, and we're seeing it on our platform with Sparkplug, with the brokers that are using that. There is a lot of brokers out there that are selling electricity and not as many selling natural gas. And there is some really good gas entrants coming into the market that Enerex has been in touch with. They want to work with brokers, and they think that, Texas obviously is a state that doesn't consume as much gas, but we know in the Northeast and the Midwest, there's a lot of gas consumed. So we'll be talking about that next week. And I just wanted to ask, there will be a follow-up email. And as you close out your browsers today and I end this webinar, there will be a survey. You guys have been so great as participants within this conversation. I hope you're willing to take the 2 minutes just to give us feedback as you close out your browser here on what we could be doing better as Enerex to continue to bring these great topics to you, and some really strong panelists that have a lot of informative information. And with that, Houston Able Power Management, really appreciate you. Sean Andrews, Cubix Energy, greatly appreciate you. And St. Clair Live Energy. Can't thank you guys enough for participating in this call today. It was really awesome. One of my favorite webinars to date.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you for having us.
Talk soon.
Bye, all. Have a great rest of the day.
Bye.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.